Good afternoon and welcome. We're live on AW360 Live in the NASDAQ studio, and we're thankful for our sponsor, Octagon, for having us here. We're here to talk about live sports and the intersection with live sports in digital, particularly in a distributed world. I've got four experts here to talk with me for the next 30 minutes, and we're going to break down all the changes in sports. As a way of introduction, I'm Jason Kint. I'm with DCN. We're the trade association for the digital content industry. All of our members are trusted content creators. And as it relates to sports, our members include Sports Illustrated, ESPN, native digital companies like Bleacher Report and SB Nation and CBS and NBC, et cetera. So my experts I want to introduce here, we've got Simon Wardle, who is the Chief Strategy Officer for Octagon. Thank you for being here, Simon.
Thank you.
Steven Stern is the partner of Flagstaff Films, specializes in documentaries. Jamie Gallo, the president of Wunderman, the marketing and promotion firm. And then Gary Cohen, who's the president of Triple Threat TV, also a documentary company. Thank you again for being here. Looking forward to this discussion. So I want to start off on the deal side, if we can. I had a 20-year history in sports myself. I know when I showed up at CBS back in 2007, the world was different. I arrived and said, okay, what sort of rights do we have to play with here? And we had rights for a lot of things, and we didn't have a lot of restrictions at that time for digital. It was mostly an internal discussion. Right. Can we use this? Can I have this? Can I play with March Madness? Can I play with SEC football? The world's changed. We're 10 years later. How are the rights being negotiated now? I'll start with you, Jamie, if you don't mind. The platforms, what are the components of these deals that they're most concerned about?
So, as you know, I worked at the NBA for a couple of years, 3 years ago, and at that time, Commissioner David Stern was predicting that Apple and Google would be bidders for our TV rights when that deal was up. And as you've seen in this last NBA deal, they've carved out a piece for digital platforms. You know, they're still with ESPN and with Turner, but they've carved out part of the deal to be able to do live streaming on different social platforms. So from the time when I was there was a perspective that we wanted to serve the fan, give them a much more immersive experience, and also be innovative in the way people were viewing sports. That was very important to the league brand at that time. So I think a lot of the leagues in the current deals that you're seeing, whether it's the NHL with Yahoo and NBC with the Olympics, are starting to carve out parts of their traditional broadcasts to serve the fans in all different kinds of ways, to aggregate audiences, because being a fan now is like being a professional. You have to be professional to be a sports fan. Yeah. You know, you always have to be on, and these new deals are allowing fans to do that.
Sure, sure. Are you seeing the innovation? I'll go to you, Simon. The innovation, is that becoming a bigger piece in terms of the new ways that you're able to tinker and use these rights? It seemed like in the early days it was just about access. It was just about, let me watch this event on a different platform.
Right. 10 years ago when you were talking about, there was really only about 5 ways you could be a fan. Obviously you could watch the game live, you could read about them, you could go to the games, you could maybe play the sport. There was some digital content, but in terms of actually consuming live sports, it was a mass media dominated world, and as a fan you could watch whatever the broadcast or cable channels chose to show. Now, you know, as we're talking about, the fan is in charge, and 24/7, if they want to consume sports content and feed their passion, that's what these digital and social platforms are enabling fans. And what we're seeing is a continuum from, you know, passive couch potato fans who are still very much living in the 1990s to, you know, this new generation of fan that the leagues and the brands want to connect with, who are embracing this technology in all the ways in which it allows them to feed their own personal passion for whatever team, athlete, or sport they care so much about. So it's a great world to live in if you're a fan, and it's a little bit scary if you're a brand trying to connect to those fans, because it was a lot easier in a mass media dominated world where you could reach those fans because there were very few places fans could go to consume live sports, and now it's It's getting a lot more complicated.
So it's no longer about just give me access on the biggest screen available, but give me access whenever, wherever, however I want it. Are the rights deals still getting in the way of that? Are there still complexities there that?
I think it's an interesting time because it's an interesting dance between the rights holders, the traditional broadcasters, and then these new platforms, because obviously the rights holders are getting a lot of money from their broadcast rights deals, yet they don't want to miss out on this new generation of fans for whom the primary consumption might not actually be broadcast media. You know, I've got 2 teenage sons in my house, so I speak from experience. The concept of watching a 3-hour game is a little bit alien to their teenage psyche, and you know, they're huge sports fans. They just consume it through non-traditional ways. So rights holders definitely want to be playing in that space, and they're just trying to figure out how to make it all work in a way that works for them, works for their broadcast partners, and works for these digital platforms that obviously prize this live sports content the same way that broadcasters do.
Great, yeah. I want to bring in Stephen and Gary here on this one. So we naturally go towards the big, expensive live rights, but the other thing that digital brings is the distribution capabilities for shoulder programming, for side programming, for other interesting angles, make sports 365 days a year. 24/7 outside of the live events. How do you see that developing?
Well, the IOC, for instance, recently just decided to go with a non-broadcast element to their IOC channel. So that gives you an idea, and they've come to a bunch of us, and I know they came to us. They probably came to Gary too, and asked what sort of programming do you think you could come up with, and it was a little bit foreign to what we normally do because we're normally long format documentary filmmakers, but they asked us to come up with things that were shorter programming to sort of fit the model, to fit the, you know, everyone wants to package down to the phone so you can, or the iPad or whatever it is, you can watch your stuff on that. And so I think that it's a challenge to us to sort of start rethinking the way we'd like to present some of our stories. And I know Gary's been in that space even a little bit more than I have recently.
Well, yeah, I mean, we come at this from the creative side, if you will, and I'm a storyteller. And I've spent most of my career telling long-form stories, but the demand these days is really more in the digital space on short storytelling. So, for example, Sports Illustrated comes to us and says, we want, you know, to monetize our library and to create original content out of shelf product that tells stories in a new way to sports audiences. So we create 1-minute vignettes for them that, you know, live on their site and that are accessible all time, anytime, anywhere. Just like our 30 for 30 films that used to be on TV and gone, now can be accessed through iTunes or, you know, through your DVR at home, and so they're perpetually available. So it's a slightly ancillary component to the predominance of the industry, which is the live broadcast component of the games and all the, you know, analytical components around it. But the storytelling parts have been expanded too, and it's another way to serve an audience, so that your teenage kids can watch long form stories about their sports too, as well as watching the games.
Do you see? I'm curious. You mentioned 30 under 30. Or 30 on 30, apologize. Do you see that other content can be presented live beyond the sports events themselves? I thought 30 on 30 was interesting, particularly with the OJ series, where people were watching that live.
Sure. So, I mean, ESPN's business model, what we're seeing is that all of the media giants have slight variations of the same business model. ESPN is driven first and foremost by their flagship channel, but then they have 5 other channels that they populate with all kinds of other programming. And then, of course, they have ESPN.com, and then, of course, they have distribution deals with iTunes and everybody else, so that when we create a property for them, it'll premiere on their flagship channel, and then it'll run on ESPN Classic or on the Deuce or whatever, and then it'll live on iTunes. And so the same property will trickle down in all different kinds of directions. HBO has a variation of those situations. When they pay a lot of money for a documentary, and these aren't cheap, but there's no rights fees the way there are for broadcast games and stuff. But when they pay it, they're going to monetize it every way they can. In the old days, you'd put it on TV, and then if it was a really big title, you'd put it out on, DVD or before that on VHS. These days, there's more ways to monetize the same kind of content.
Right, right.
Like, and we have two shows that we did recently and one that we're going to do now. We did Inside the Stanley Cup playoffs for Showtime, and we're doing a season with Florida State football for Showtime. And they'll be presented the same way Gary's talking about, which is it's not that Netflix model in which, or the Amazon model where they did the NFL show and they took last season with the Arizona Cardinals, and they put the whole show together and released them all at the same time. Our shows still air each week. They still are sort of done in that traditional television model and format, but you can find them in a host of other places, whereas you only, as Gary said, we're able to find them on air. And then if you didn't watch them on air, you had to search them out in some other way. Now you can watch our same shows on the phone or on your iPad a day after, or even simultaneously in some cases.
I want to go back to, I was going to add, you were asking about how people are viewing as rights holders or as distributors. I would say that the only one entity holding back the pure distribution of everything, we talked about it being over the top and kind of going over the top of the cable companies, are the cable companies. Because they're leaning back and holding on to legacy deals, and they want to force people into their own channels, whether they're TV or mobile now. So I would say, my recollection was they were resistant back then. I can only imagine they are right now, because ESPN's trying to go over the top too. Showtime just launched their over-the-top channel, so direct to consumer via application. So it's you have people who are kind of entrenched in what they have always done, but reluctantly moving forward because it serves people and fans.
Does that create risk then, where fans then, and certainly the content companies want to move, the programmers want to move towards rights that they can get their hands on. Right. The fans move to sports that they have access to. Does that cause a move away from mainstream sports or more niche programming? Because
I don't think it has.
Okay.
I think, again, I think it's moving in that direction reluctantly, but I don't think it's caused a shift away from traditional sports into Ultimate Fighting Championship or lacrosse, which is an up and coming sport. I think, to your point about your sons, I think viewing over 3 hours has become the concern, the length of times. You heard about the Commissioner of Baseball talking about the length of games and limiting the amount of relief pitchers, because it's about short form and long form consumption. That's what they're more concerned with, I think.
Makes sense. So let's connect to the advertiser piece of it. What's great about live sports is you have a guaranteed audience, right? It's DVR proof. It also is powerful from a digital perspective because it brings in social media.
Yep.
Right? I remember there's a stat, I'm sure it's still true, there was a stat that roughly 40% of all tweets about television programming were sports related, even though sports was only like 2% of the actual programming. So it brings together social, it brings together live, brings together everything. That must be an advertiser's dream, right? A sponsor's dream.
Dream and nightmare, yes.
Talk about the nightmare.
Well, it's just so complicated with the fact that the world is so fragmented, and the fans now have these multitudes of what they're living in a world of choice, and as a brand, you absolutely want to connect with these interactive fans, because from research that we've done, we know that the more interactive a fan is, the more predisposed they are to supporting brands that sponsor things that they are passionate about. So that's why it's incredibly important for brands to be on these social and digital platforms, because they're environments that are target rich. These are the home of the interactive professional fans who are going to change their behavior, are much more likely to change their behavior. So that's the dream part, is you've got a lot of highly prized consumers who are predisposed to supporting your brand. The challenge and the nightmare is to make sure that you're there where they are, adding value to that experience and capitalizing on the goodwill that these interactive fans are. So, there was a lot to be said for a mass media dominated world when you're a brand and ubiquity was a strategy. It's hard to be ubiquitous in a world of choice that fans today live in.
Yeah, and so you're hinting to it, both the production, the creative work that it takes to be in all these different places. I think you're also maybe hinting at scale as an issue. How do we run into scale issues with some of these live sports events that aren't the?
I think one of the interesting things that you're seeing, again, going back to my sons, is yes, they'll sit in front of the television, but this is the #1 screen. And what you're seeing with deals like Twitter's deal with the NFL for Thursday Night Football is almost a convergence of the content and the conversation that you're talking about converging on one screen. So this notion of multi-screening almost becomes obsolete at that point, because it's a convergence of live sports content and conversation through one medium and one platform, which is kind of an interesting aspect of some of these new deals.
It'll be interesting to see how everyone reacts to that. I think they were testing a little bit with the conventions on the election cycle and streaming that. It'll be interesting to see how NFL comes across inside of a social media platform like that. When you get out to the smaller sports, though, there's always been discussion around high school sports and all these different types of programming that we can now produce live because of the internet, because you can go live immediately like we are right now on Facebook. What size audience is too small? Is there a number? I mean, because is it interesting to do sports for 100 people?
To the 100 people who are watching, yes.
I would position that differently, because to me, there was a series that just dropped on Netflix called Last Chance U. Okay. And it's one of those immersive kind of 24/7 environment stories like Hard Knocks or any of those, about a junior college that nobody has ever heard of. But it's a junior college with a good story, because this is where the great players go to the middle of nowhere for their last chance to bust out. To me, that is exactly what you're talking about. Nobody cares about that until you put it on Netflix, tell the story brilliantly well, and say, you should care about this. And then sometimes, if the storyteller does his job right, then you will care about it, and you have a breakout success. Usually it just comes and goes.
Yeah, but in the live space, like we were discussing before, recently ESPN was showing lacrosse semifinals, or I think it was the second round of lacrosse. I might be off on that. Okay. NCAA lacrosse. Yep. It rained, and they had to get off the field in which the ESPN had their cameras. So they were lucky, apparently, that someone there, a parent, had was shooting the game on the iPhone and figured out how to stream the action onto I think it was Facebook Live. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was that. And the point being that got a lot of press, a lot of play about how quickly they were able to sort of react, and the people, whatever number who were watching the game in the first place, were extremely excited that they were then able to just switch over to that platform and watch the game. Yeah. So at that point, your production value is not all that, it's not all that high, but certainly not all that costly either. You're not set up with your 4 cameras. You just sort of, there you are. And I guess people accepted it. Will they accept that all the time? I don't know the answer to that.
Puts the value back on the storyteller at some point, right?
Yeah, the game was interesting enough, people are going to watch it. And they're going to watch it on one camera on an iPhone and not with a 52 camera setup like they do for the Super Bowl, which
for a lot less money.
I think the prediction of television being dead is kind of overstated, and that's an obvious statement, because if you look at the last NBA Finals, they had the highest ratings they've had in quite some time. So if there's a good story, sure, people will tune in. I mean, television is still it provides scale, to your point. So how you build experiences as a brand or an advertiser around that becomes the job of what some of us do.
Right. And for instance, where you consume certain things certain times. Like this weekend, I was out. You get dragged to the mall or whatever it is, and as the husband, go ahead, go into the store. You used to have to sit there and sort of watch what was going on around you. Now you take out your phone. I was watching the PGA Championship on the phone, because you can now do that, and that's pretty beneficial to people when they're out and about and watching things.
Access, mobility.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do notice, they were on the air Sunday morning. They came on the air at 7 o'clock in the morning. They went straight to their video stream for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. Then they went to TNT. Yeah. Then they went to CBS. So that little window there, it gave you an idea of how flexible they can be and how flexible
all complementing each other.
All complementing each other, yes. Sometimes they're on together. Sometimes they're on separately
Yeah.
on their own.
Well, TNT and CBS have, even with the March Madness, have done a very good job,
Yeah.
complementing each other and then providing all the digital platforms around March Madness.
Yeah, yeah. When you have all the rights, it's much easier to make
Yes.
sure they all work
Yeah,
together
exactly.
rather than fight with each other, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, the one thing that hasn't happened yet in our world is one of the services buying the rights outright and then operating from that. They're all taking, like, even the NFL deal, they're taking the CBS produced game and putting it on. They're not doing it themselves yet.
Right.
And they're not doing it themselves at the level that costs a lot of money. If they are doing it themselves, recently there was what deal was made the other day? The CONCACAF Champions Cup. But I assume they're taking the international television feed and putting it on the phone or on the streaming service. They're not doing it themselves.
It's practical issues too. They don't have multiple crews in the.
Right, and that costs a lot of money. And then when you talked about scale before, it's a lot easier for NBC to do what they're doing with the Olympics because they're already there doing it for
Let's shift
television.
the Olympics, if you don't mind. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about the Olympics, I think I saw 6,500 hours of programming, of live programming, 4,500 digital. The number just keeps getting bigger every Olympics. How are you going to be consuming the Olympics? What's your primary way that you think you'll be consuming the Olympics? Will it be through your phone, through the television, in between moments, tuning in?
I think probably U.S. productivity is going to go down a little bit over the next 2 weeks as people at work are watching events on their mobile device, their laptop, and again, to the point that was made earlier, prime time is still going to deliver huge audiences.
Yeah.
So broadcast television isn't going away, but again, these digital platforms just offer that choice. And whether it's archery, weightlifting, or one of these more esoteric sports that maybe won't get any primetime coverage on NBC, if you're a fan of that sport or you're a participant in that sport, you now have that option. And
I think the Olympics are really a unique case because we're used to sports being an annual event. There's a World Series every year, there's a Super Bowl every year, there's an NBA championship. But if you're a weightlifting fan or if you're a track and field fan, the annual World Championships don't measure up to the Olympics in terms of the impact. So when there is this quadrennial event, it's the biggest thing in 4 years, and I'm a big fencing buff. Now I can absorb fencing for the first time ever in all of its glory for dozens of hours, maybe hundreds of hours. And so what you get is a more fragmented audience because those fencing fans are now not watching whatever it is, the gymnastics on primetime TV on the flagship channel. They're watching fencing on some digital streaming outlet. But you have a passionate audience that creates an opportunity for you guys, the marketers, to find a sponsor that really wants those fencers or those fencing fans.
And the fencing fans will find it.
right.
Yeah.
You asked that question about is 100 too small of an audience? If that 100 is a fanatical set of fencing aficionados,
Interesting.
then that's a highly prized audience.
Even more passionate about what they're watching for the Olympics than they would be if they were tuning into the main feed.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Yep.
Anyone else in terms, I'm curious if how behavior's changing with this Olympics. Are you going to be watching in a different way, do you think, this time than you did 4 years ago?
Personally?
Yeah. Starts this weekend.
I think my personal viewing will be if there's some milestone or pivotal event, if the basketball, USA basketball is going for the gold, that's a television kind of appointment kind of situation. If it's checking in on somebody that I follow through the news, that I might have read something on ESPN, I want to check something out, that would most likely be more mobile in nature, I think.
I'll give you a story because you were there.
Go away. Yep.
And this will never happen again. This is what I find exciting about where we're going. 1972, we lost the gold medal to the Russians, and we waited 4 years to watch the 1976 final game against the Russians again. It's going to be great. We can't wait to get there. The Russians lose to the Yugoslavians, so now we're not playing the Russians in the 76 final. And when I say we, I say the Americans. ABC's got the game. It's from Montreal. They're showing the game. We're watching it. We're all excited to watch it. And then they cut away and go to something else. And we miss 6, 7, 8 minutes of the game. And they come back and That'll never happen again.
Yeah.
You know, you will never, ever not be able to watch everything in its entirety if you want to, whether it's on your television, whether it's on an alternate channel, whether it's on the phone, the iPad, streaming, whatever it is.
There's a camera on it.
Yeah, there's a camera on it, and we are now, we can see everything all the time, and we're going to get to the point where we're going to be able to see multiple versions of that actually going forward too, because they're going to allow us to do our own thing. So
You bring up Montreal, it makes me think that beyond having more hours of programming as they do each Olympics, I think this is the first one that's the Summer Olympics that's actually in a U.S. time zone. That's since Atlanta, which was '96 when we weren't streaming really. So how's that going to affect things, do you think? Is that just spike everything even more during your workday?
I think from my standpoint, the Olympics are actually getting, are losing steam in the sports landscape. And I think part of the reason is that we have these patterns of behavior. You know, I'm a baseball fan, so I follow the game regularly on my At-Bat app on my phone, and I watch MLB Network and so on and so forth. The Olympic mentality as a year-round thing, I'm not an Olympics fan. They don't even have baseball in the Olympics, but I might be a basketball fan, but the basketball doesn't interest me in the Olympics because I don't have an 8-month season building up to what the crescendo. So the only thing that's going to get my attention are the things that already have the story behind them. I know the story of Usain Bolt. I've lived with it for the last 8 years. I want to see him run. I want to see if he caps his career with yet another astonishing. But the other stuff is just like, who is this guy and why do I care? There are a million sports. There's more than I can focus on. And the only ones that I care about are the ones I'm connected to. Okay, Michael Phelps, I get it. You know, there's a whole backstory around Michael Phelps, and there'll be new stories that come out. Somebody has some adversity or some unique team backstory that, you know, catches fire in the media. But I think the volume of what the Olympics is fighting against the entrenched positions of the audience and their viewing habits. And it's going to be harder for it to break through.
Yeah, but the Olympics create those people. I mean, the one thing in Olympic programming is it's storytelling platform. The backstories on athletes that you don't know. So out of that 6,500 hours, I would imagine, and NBC does a good job of this. We looked at it when we were at the league as far as related to the WNBA, because we were trying to get the players more familiar, become more familiar with fans. But they create Gabriella Reese, they create Michael Phelps, they create Bolt. And so those stories kind of emerge in the next 2 weeks. Who knows who the next person is?
If I'm paying attention.
If you're paying attention.
Yeah, that's their challenge to me. Yeah.
That is an interesting challenge, because as the younger consumers in particular are flipping it around and consuming from their social media, tuning in because of what's being discussed, that changes the dynamic.
That's a big difference, I think. You know, clearly that it used to be the other way around, and now it's inverted for the younger viewer. That they are looking for their stuff off of social media. That's where they get most of their, you know, ideas of where to go and what to watch, as opposed to when we were there, where we were getting it. Well, it wasn't there, but you know, we had to watch the broadcast to figure that stuff out.
What sport are you going to be watching most closely this Olympics?
I got to say Michael Phelps. I think he's going to be the big story.
Yeah.
No, I watch track and field. It's always been the most interesting thing to me at the Olympics.
Yeah.
I'm a basketball guy.
Basketball?
Yeah.
Track and field.
Track
It's
and
every
field.
4 years, and it's special.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's soccer for me. But, yeah, so.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you for tuning in here for AW360 Live. Thank you to our guests. Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise. We'll wrap there, and thank you for tuning in live on Facebook.